Hello and welcome to Security in Context. I'm Anita Fuentes, and today I'm speaking with Samar Al-Bulushi, Assistant Professor of Anthropology at UC Irvine and author of Warmaking as Worldmaking. In this interview, we'll be discussing her book, which explores the entanglement of militarism, imperialism, and governance in contemporary East Africa, arguing that Kenya has become a key player in the post 9/11 era of endless war. So, welcome, Samara. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Anita. It's good to be here with you.
So, to start, I'd like to ask you if you could tell us how this book came together. Because in the preface, you reflect on your career in international human rights. So, how did your professional background shape the questions that you chose to ask and also the way that you approached the research?
Great. So I spent about 10 years working in the field of international human rights, as you mentioned, prior to pursuing my PhD. And one of the organizations that I worked with roughly in 2006 to 2010 timeframe was called the International Center for Transitional Justice. And more broadly, I would say, in the context of the work that I did with groups like the ICTJ, one of the things that I observed was how human rights had become very professionalized, in the sense that the focus was primarily on documenting and verifying information and on technocratic approaches to political problems. And one example that I offer in the preface to the book is the immediate aftermath of the post election violence in Kenya in 2007, 2008, where groups like the ICTJ and others were especially concerned with the police violence that had taken place, and more broadly, the role of the police in causing displacement across the country. So over 1,100 people were killed, over 700,000 people were displaced, and the ICTJ was especially concerned about the police's excessive use of force, and as such, they were really focused on the question of police reform. And they were insisting on the importance of capacity building and trainings and human rights in order to rebuild trust in the Kenyan police. Now, if we think about the timing of this, this is again early 2008. This coincided with the emergence of the US Military Command for Africa, otherwise known as AFRICOM. And so it was at this very same time that the US had been channeling substantial amounts of security related assistance to the region. And Kenya, in particular, had become a major recipient of US security assistance. And it was through the receipt of that kind of funding that Kenya was able to set up new security bodies on top of the existing ones, including entities like the Anti Terror Police Unit. And what I came to learn, if we fast forward a few years later, when I decided to pursue a focus on Kenya and its relationship to the war on terror, was that an issue of particular concern around that time of 2007, 2008, in the lead up to that election, that momentous election, was the role of those very security bodies in the arbitrary arrest and disappearance of Kenyan Muslims. But at the time when I was working at the ICTJ, those kinds of questions, namely the role of the United States as an external entity and as an imperial power, right, that was exerting pressure on Kenya, was something that exceeded the frame of most human rights organizations. Their focus was really a prescriptive one, right, in the sense that they were driven by a commitment to accountability. And that didn't allow for thinking through much more explicitly political questions about the dynamics that were fueling and enabling police abuse. Another element that really struck me and that I'm trying to push back against in the book is that what some scholars refer to as methodological nationalism, right? In the sense that the focus was squarely within the boundaries of the Kenyan state. And in doing so, you reify this idea of the state as a seemingly discrete unit that's disconnected from wider geographies and histories. So, given the political and economic pressure that was placed on the Kenyan government to embrace the US counterterrorism agenda, I wanted to think about how US interests and funding were shaping the priorities of the Kenyan state. And at the time, I was, kind of conflicted and frustrated with the fact that that was not being accounted for within what were much more prescriptive calls for the rule of law. So, if we think very concretely about this notion of quote unquote security sector reform, on one day, the Kenyan police might be receiving training in human rights, but the next day they might be receiving training in counterinsurgency tactics, right? In the name of quote unquote security. And so it was that kind of contradiction that I wanted to wrestle with. And in addition to that, right, and the broader question of US empire, I wanted to think about the significance of entanglement and what it would mean to bring both Kenya and the United States into the same kind of analytic frame in order to understand the full range of dynamics.
Thank you. So yeah, I was going to ask you, maybe you already have started to do this, but if you could give us a sense of the main arguments in the book. So, and particularly why you think it's important to expand on how we think about geopolitics, to include questions of culture and imagination. And if I may ask as well, what was the thinking behind the title, War Making as World Making?
Absolutely. So I think in the title itself, I was really inspired by the work of scholars like Edom Getachew, whose book Worldmaking After Empire, I think really was of great interest, largely because it foregrounded the role of Global South thinkers and actors in thinking in an international way, right? That in looking at the role of leaders like Nkrumah and Nyerere in the lead up to independence and the post-independence period on the African continent, Getachew is helping us push back against the tendency to confine African political leaders to the quote unquote periphery of world affairs and instead insist on the world making implications of their thought and practice. And so I wanted to engage that idea, but to do so in a way that accounted for the more sobering elements of world making, quote unquote, from the South. So by that, I mean that I wanted to shift our attention away from the more romanticized focus on emancipatory and liberatory politics and wrestle with the ways in which global South leaders become entangled in and complicit with practices of war making and violence. So those are some of the thoughts that inspired the title for the book. As far as the argument is concerned, there are two kind of broad arguments that I tried to make. The first is I want to push back against the tendency by critics of the US-led war on terror who generally focus only on US strategy and tend to dismiss Global South partner states as mere puppets. And I suggest that that tendency has the effect of reinscribing the West or the global North as the primary agent of history. Now, the result of that is that it means we have few analytical tools to grasp the growing role of seemingly peripheral countries in shaping the norms and politics of militarized interventionism today. Now, I argue that Kenya is one such important actor, but we might consider any number of other actors, and within the African continent, Rwanda would be another such example, because Rwanda has taken the quote unquote initiative to spearhead interventions in places like Mozambique. The second argument I make is that the human impact of the war on terror extends far beyond the geographies of officially declared war zones like Iraq and Afghanistan. We have some sense, I think, among critical scholars, investigative journalists, of the destructive effects of drone strikes in Somalia. But I think one of the key points I make is that the bulk of AFRICOM's operations, again, the US Africa Command, the bulk of its operations are in fact conducted by quote unquote partner forces. And this dispersal of power has had a marked impact on the spatiality of organized violence. And I argue that this really requires that we need to adopt a wider geographical lens when we're reflecting on the lived realities of the war on terror. But with that said, I'm also careful to insist that we should avoid a singular fixation with violence alone, right? As much as it's important to be shedding light on the realities of the war on terror, the risk here, if our only focus is on violence, is that we risk reproducing the very racialized imaginaries and ways of seeing that critics of the war on terror, in theory, are trying to challenge. So here, one example I give is that in a lot of activism related to AFRICOM, there's a tendency to rely on maps of US military bases to capture the scale and the scope of imperial power around the continent. But I suggest that images like this come with the risk of presenting Africa as just a vast abstract space that's singularly defined by imperial violence. And so, what I'm trying to do in the book is to tell a story that exceeds the visuality of the military base, and that's attuned to the microhistories, the micro-practices, the embodied knowledge formations of people that have been caught in the crosshairs. And I think that by attending in a more ethnographic way to human encounters at police precincts, for example, at prisons, in homes, in mosques and schools, that what we start to see is a more lived material landscape, that it becomes more relatable to us in ways that these maps of military bases are simply not. And so I'm very much inspired by the work of transnational feminist scholars here who push us to ground our theorizing in very concrete spaces and places, and to be making and thinking across scales, right? Thinking about how we can make connections between the so-called global and the local. And one scholar in particular that I engage with is that of Vasuki Nasaya, who pushes us to think about US empire as a story of multiple plots in small places. And so I think here this creates an opening to tell, and this is one of the goals of my book, is to tell an un-American story of US empire by broadening the people and the places that we deem to be important to our understanding of this war.
It's honestly so fascinating to hear you talk about it. It's so interesting to me. But yeah, I also wanted to go back to the questions that I had for you. So in chapter 2, you talk about how the war on terror has repoliticized debates around race and indigeneity on the Kenyan coast, particularly in relation to coastal Muslim communities. So, how do these racialized dynamics intersect with the state's efforts to brand the coast as an exotic space within the national tourism industry?
Yeah, so maybe I can start here by speaking more generally about the significance of race when we're talking about the war on terror in the African continent, knowing that Africa has long been framed through the lens of race in such a way that it is associated already, right, as that it's thought of as a space of violence. And so that's the first kind of hurdle that we have to think through as scholars and analysts, is how not to reinforce those racialized imaginative geographies. And then if you add the dimension of religion that comes with the war on terror and the way in which Muslims across the world have been racialized as threatening, then it adds a new dimension, right, to the ways in which the African continent is racialized as a space of threat and violence. Now, we can then zoom in to the specific context of Kenya, which has its own historically specific dynamics related to race and religion and ethnicity, etc. And the population that I spent the most time with, and the place that I spent the most time with while I was in Kenya, and I should mention that this was roughly 10 years ago when I was doing my long-term ethnographic research. The place I spent time was on the Kenyan coast in the city of Mombasa, which is the second largest city in the country, and which is primarily Muslim. Kenya itself is a predominantly Christian country, and Muslims make up about 20% of the population. And over the last 20 or so years, the Kenyan state has actively shaped public fears by fostering a Christian majority sensibility that associates its Muslim population with suspicion and violence. But what's significant here is that the production of threat is both racialized and spatialized, with Muslims in particular areas of the country, like the coast, like northeastern Kenya, which sits along the border with Somalia. So these are the kinds of populations that are viewed with particular concern. And we can take specific moments in recent Kenyan history where that has come to the fore. We can start with 1998 when Al-Qaeda bombed the US embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. And at that time, the Kenyan government was convinced and was making arguments to the effect that the attackers were quote unquote Arabs from the coast. And this is due to the fact that Muslim populations on the coast have longstanding historical ties with the Arabian Gulf across the Indian Ocean. And then more recently, in 2013, with the Nairobi Westgate Mall attack, the focus there was that the attackers had come from northeastern Kenya and or from Nairobi itself, where there are pockets of ethnic Somalis, so Kenyans who are ethnically Somali. And in both of these instances, the government has suggested that these communities are easily, quote unquote, radicalized because of their ties to cross-border kinship and trade networks. And these transnational ties are at the heart of longstanding anxieties about, quote unquote, threatening outsiders. And this has ties to and is informed by colonial era categories of, quote unquote, native African Islam that was juxtaposed against, quote unquote, non-native Arab and Swahili or Somali Islam. So one of the points I make in the book is that all of this history, this very historically specific history, right, connected to Indian Ocean trade and kinship networks matters, and that we need to be accounting for the ways in which colonial rule and the ideological remnants of colonial rule continue to shape what we might call the cultural politics of suspicion in Kenya today. And all of that informs the ways in which the Kenyan security apparatus has been able to construct Muslims as figures of concern. Now, to get very briefly to the question you asked about nation branding on the coast, what I capture in chapter 2 is this kind of seeming contradiction in the sense that the coast on the one hand is racialized as a space of suspicion and violence, but at the same time, it's precisely these Indian Ocean histories of trade that have made the coast really integral to the country's branding and to the national tourism industry, in the sense that they have been able to promote the coast as this kind of Oriental wonderland in order to draw foreigners, especially Europeans. And so one of the things I wrestle with in that chapter is the continued significance of whiteness and white supremacy that, again, is a lingering element of colonial rule and colonial ideologies that continues to inform the ways in which the Kenyan state and political leaders within it think of themselves, present themselves, present Kenya as a particular place in the world. And so I just found those contradictions to be fascinating and worth unpacking.
So I want to go back about the part where you mentioned that you employed an ethnographic approach in your research. And I wanted to ask you specifically, what insights does this kind of approach reveal about the more subtle, and specifically in your research, about the more subtle everyday forms of policing and surveillance that are very often overlooked in conventional analyses of militarism and security?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think in general, it is a challenge for those of us who are trying to make sense of macro level dynamics like US empire, right? Um, the question, certainly within anthropology, becomes how can we get at this thing that we call US empire ethnographically? And um, that's why, for example, I mentioned the work of Vasuki Nesaya and other feminists who really encourage us to think about the ways in which US empire manifests concretely on the ground in particular places and spaces. And feminist scholars have been especially helpful in deconstructing and getting us to think more critically about the kinds of spaces that are deemed to be relevant for our thinking about empire and geopolitics. So, whereas the tendency might be to focus on more explicitly political spaces, for example, like the White House, Congress, the UN, feminists push us to think about the space of the home, for example, and the domain of affect and emotion and embodied knowledge formations that should be taken just as seriously in our the ways in which we want to learn about U.S. empire. And so, just to give you a sense of the three more heavily ethnographic chapters in the book, one focuses on the work of human rights activists, Kenyan human rights activists, primarily on the coast, who are wrestling with how to document and confront the abuses carried out by US trained Kenyan police and their role in disappearances and extrajudicial killings. And there I really highlight the significance of the kind of knowledge that is accumulated by these human rights activists. And I refer to it as, I use the term phantom epistemologies to capture the ways in which their knowledge is tentative and unverifiable because it's impossible to definitively prove the involvement of the United States in each of the instances that they're tracking. And yet they know, they have reason to believe the US has been involved. And so in that chapter, I really want to decenter the more recognized quote unquote experts who speak with a lot of certainty and confidence and identify themselves as quote unquote experts, but who are not at the forefront and quite literally caught in the crosshairs of these dynamics. And so I'm suggesting that we need to take more seriously this unverifiable knowledge of those who are caught in the crosshairs, because in many ways it's precisely their lack of certainty that leaves more room to learn more, right? That recognizes that there's yet still more to learn, and that recognizes that US empire is constantly shapeshifting, which requires that you have to be on your toes, that you can never speak of it definitively. The next chapter focuses on the significance of the home place as both a site of geopolitics in the sense that it has become a site of concern for security actors who worry that children are being radicalized and who think that mothers in particular have a role to play in drawing their children away from quote unquote radicalization. But then I also show the other ways in which the home is entangled in the politics of war and empire, in the sense that the home also becomes a site to process. One, it becomes a site that is invaded quite literally by the police, in the sense that the police are conducting more and more raids on the homes of Muslims. We see this in Kenya. We see this elsewhere in the context of the war on terror. And I try to capture the destabilizing impact of those raids on family life. And yet at the same time, again, not wanting to focus exclusively on these more explicit forms of violence, I show the ways in which family members try to reclaim the site of the home as a space of safety and as a space in which knowledge can circulate, right? So again, it becomes a key site in which people are trying to make sense of what's going on, to share knowledge, to anticipate any potential challenges they may encounter, whether it's at a checkpoint, a roadblock, thinking about potential travel bans, that kind of a thing. And then the final ethnographic chapter looks at the significance of friendship. And I focus especially on a friendship between two young Muslim men who each experienced arrest and time in prison, and who are just trying to find a way to process what it means to live in a constant state of surveillance, to be constantly monitored by the police. And my goal there is to push back against the tendency by quote unquote security experts who tend to think of young Muslim men only in a particular way, namely that these are figures who are concerned exclusively and singularly with the political domain, as though they're not equally concerned with uh, concerned with their more private domain, in the sense of thinking about questions of marriage and whether it's possible to marry, given their background, having been arrested, and again, coming back to the theme of friendship, to try to capture the significance of friendship for these young men. So it's a more intimate domain that tends to be overlooked, and in doing so, dismisses the very notion that friendship is something that is important to young Muslim men today.
I love that. I love all of those chapters. The last question that I wanted to ask you is about both something that you tackle in your book and also that you addressed in a recent article for Jacobin, where you reflect on Kenya's emerging role in the planned multinational police intervention in Haiti. So, what does this intervention tell us about the evolving nature of imperialism today? And how do you think we should understand Kenya's position within the shifting global power dynamics?
Yeah, so maybe I can start with the May 2024 visit by the president of Kenya, William Ruto, to the White House. This was the first state visit by an African head of state in quite a long time. I think the last one that had occurred was in 2008. And so that in and of itself, the fact that Kenya was granted this privilege, right, of coming to the White House, speaks volumes about the growing geopolitical significance of Kenya and its relationship to U.S. empire. And it was during this visit that they announced the formal launch of the U.S.-backed, Kenyan-led multinational police intervention in Haiti. And at the time, and the lead up to this, it was something that was kind of on our radar for, I would say, 9 or 10 months leading up to that announcement of the launch, where U.S. Officials took a trip to Nairobi, I think like in July or August the prior year, 2023. And it was reported to us that they had to convince the Kenyan government to take on this role. And because I had been studying Kenyan foreign policy for quite some time, I was kind of skeptical of the notion that the Kenyans had to have their arms twisted for this, right? And I had a sense that they had their own interests that were motivating them. One of them being that the deployment in Somalia, where Kenya has had troops now since October 2011, was kind of coming to a close. And remittances by the Kenyan security forces that have been deployed have become a really important segment of the Kenyan national economy. And the Kenyan military acknowledges this on its own website. And so you can see how Kenyan officials were kind of anticipating the drawdown of the deployment in Somalia and thinking about, okay, where next in terms of our continued ability to access funds. So that was certainly one element. But if we were to come back to an earlier part of our conversation where we were talking about the significance of culture and the imagination for our understanding of geopolitics, one of the arguments that I make in the book is that Kenya has invested a huge amount of time, labor, and money to shape its image on the world stage. And really, very much at the heart of this image is its rise as a quote unquote leader on questions of security. And so, as much as political economy was and is a very significant dimension to the role that it's playing, I think it's also important that we look at how much effort they've extended to present themselves, whether it's, the money they invested to campaign to have a seat on the UN Security Council a few years ago, whether it's the creation of kind of a communications wing to the Kenyan military, which itself has been producing all kinds of material for public consumption about the valor of the Kenyan police, of the Kenyan military as they serve in Somalia. All of those things I think we need to take into consideration when thinking about the role and the decision making of Kenya on questions of security. And I think connected to this is that, again, coming back to the notion of imagination, is that the political economy of war making, right, is inseparable from the realm of symbols, rhetoric, and meaning. And one part I neglected to mention earlier is that it's not sufficient for the Kenyan state itself to be on board when it comes to these deployments, right? That they actually need to invest energy in convincing their own population that the role that it's playing is an important one. And so there's kind of a cultural conscripting that's necessary here of bringing Kenyan citizens, drawing them into the project of war and empire. Now, what's significant about the Haiti deployment, and that has some parallels to the Somali deployment, is that they're framing their role as distinct from that of, white quote unquote saviors, right? So we're seeing this shift away from the image of the Euro-American savior to that of the Black African quote unquote comrade. And what's significant about the Haiti intervention is that Kenyan leaders have been framing their decision to get involved in Haiti in the language of Pan-African solidarity rather than as a charitable offer of support. And so here we see invocations of Pan-Africanism wielded by state officials that function to obscure questions of power, right? Because ultimately Kenya wields far more power than Haiti does in this instance. And what we see here is the ways in which contemporary imperial formations are working to incorporate historically marginal and racialized others like Kenya, who have their own aspirations of exceptionalism, right? Because again, if we come back to this idea of the cultural and imaginative dimension and Kenya's role on the global stage, Kenya has been very, very explicit about distinguishing itself from other African states, and here again also from Haiti, by positioning itself in direct contrast to Haiti as an exceptional Black nation that stands poised to help others, rather than the more stereotypical "quote unquote" failed state that exists at the mercy of, primarily what has been white liberal interventionism. And so what we see as the effect of this, right, is that all of this ends up being a form of divide and rule, right? Is that you're positioning Kenyans against Haitians, despite the invocations of sameness in the rhetoric of Pan-Africanism. The final point that I'll make here is that the mainstream media was portraying the Kenyan intervention as a Kenyan-led operation, right? So we were hearing a lot about the quote-unquote Kenyan police and the role that they would play, but then left out of the story are the ties to U.S. empire, right? And so overall, the argument that I'm making in the book, and it has just as much relevance to the Haiti context, even though that's a more recent one, is that we need to be examining Kenya and the U.S. together in a dynamic, albeit unequal political field. And so Kenya's embrace of militarized interventionism and the US's championing of African solutions, which is what we've seen more and more, can't be interpreted independently of one another, because ultimately they're both playing a role, and this is a jointly authored project of remaking the world through war.
Samar, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today and for sharing your book with us. And to our audience, thank you for listening. And if you enjoyed this discussion, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on X, on Facebook, and LinkedIn.